It is 8:41 Newstalk Sauga 960 Raw. Mike Richards along with Dave Bastl and our very good friend Bruce Dowbiggin. This would be book number, boy, what is this? 800?
723. Yes.
How many books now? What are we at?
It should be around. I think it's 10, something
10.
like that. Yeah, I
10?
had
No,
a
it's more
couple
than
books.
that.
What's that?
Take the over. Take the over on that. Only 10, really?
Take the side. No, I had a couple of books with one with Donovan Bailey and one with Greg Zahn that never materialized. So it would be a lot more than it is. But there you go.
And this is different because Evan Dowbiggin is also a part of the book called Inexact Science: The Six Most Compelling Draft Years in NHL History. Good morning, Evan.
Good morning. How are you guys?
We're good, just so you know. Here on Zoom, we're having a little bit of an issue with the camera with Evan, so
Yes.
it looks like he's in the witness protection program. So,
That's okay.
maybe he's upset somebody. I don't know if it's the Canadians. I don't know who it is, but if it's the Canadians that you've upset, that's trouble in your world, Evan, because I think you're kind of a fan.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of. Well, this is interesting because as soon as I saw the title of this book, this is built to cause tremendous arguments and discussion amongst hockey fans, because this is the kind of stuff that you think of. What if this had happened? What if that? So what is the genesis for the book, Bruce? What I assume it's got to be in that area somewhere about, well, what if this team drafted this guy or this position? Just explain what the book is.
Well, these are the kind of discussions that Evan and I have had ever since he became a hockey fan, and got refined a little bit in the last couple of years about trying to decide which were the seminal draft years that matter, because it's let's just say it's an important thing. And so we've been always sort of making this list about which would be the 6 or 10 or whatever the list would be the most important ones. So we basically put our heads together, and we figured out the 6 most important, most compelling years. Some of them involved guys who weren't even drafted. One of the chapters is about a guy who wasn't even drafted, who, of course, you know who that is, Mike.
Yes. Yeah. So he was significant from what I understand.
Yeah.
And-
Higher number 2. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do think it's interesting. So if we're talking hockey in particular, certain, I would say by position in different sports, seemingly is a little more of a roll of the dice than other ones. Like people would say, yeah, you draft a quarterback in the NFL, it's a bona fide blue chip guy, it's going to work out.
It's tradition, yeah.
It could be anything. Matt Leinart, you could go through. I mean, Ryan Leaf, you could go through a bunch of them where the math didn't work out. And sometimes, at least to my thinking, in that sport, it generally has to do with the kind of offense that you play at that level of college ball, as opposed to the landscape at the time of what's going on in the NFL. And some of them don't translate at all. Like some of them it just is math that's bad. In hockey, it's not as extreme. Like you're basically playing a similar style, even in, say, junior hockey, college hockey, as you're going to play in the NHL. In football, it can be just not applicable. So why the, again, it's inexact, the science of drafting. But I'll be honest, there must be, at least in your opinion, some franchises who do it better than others.
Well, Ev, I think you'd agree with me that the thing that's unique about hockey is that each of the guys that we've chosen and each of the years we've chosen, those guys led hockey in a new direction. Mike, your point is really well taken about football guys who come in and then the coach says, I don't care what you did in college, here's what you're doing in the pros, and it doesn't work. But each one of these guys, AF, basically took the sport in a new direction.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just necessarily the drafts that launched the greatest legends of hockey that we went for, but it certainly helps make it more intriguing every time there's a generational superstar. I think in some cases there's been drafts where there's 2 guys that everyone didn't know who was going to be the primo sort of superstar of the 2. So we saw that with Ovechkin and Malkin. So there was intrigue going to that draft. However, it's kind of the first time that happened was in 71 with Guy Lafleur and Marcel Dion. So I kind of thought that maybe, if we went through 2004, it's sort of a similar story to that, really. Like it's kind of replayed itself out, 33 years later, but where there was kind of a bit of a debate going in. Whereas when we examined various stories from, the 1984. It's obvious Mario Lemieux was the guy, and it's obvious what Eric Lindros was the guy, and Sidney Crosby. So there were great stories outside those guys in each one of those drafts too, though. So that's kind of why we went in that direction. That there's something interesting to see beyond Mario Lemieux from his year. Although he is obviously, the guy became the main story, became the big deal. But if you look further in the drafts, years that were selected, that were examined, there was so much else to bite into, because other years there were big names, and just that really all there was, and there wasn't anything like as time goes on, we found out other drafts were pretty significant in terms of what they yielded for players, but that it was a combination of how it resonated years later and how it was at the time that we really thought was the most interesting years to pick from, and not to pick too many in a small time.
The thing about the Dion and Lafleur year was, and the reason we chose that too, Mike, is because that was the first year that people realized.
Here I am.
Oh, there you go, Ev.
There it is.
That was the first year that people realized that the draft mattered. That all of a sudden that the Canadians taught the world that the draft mattered. And of course, it was that year between Lafleur and Dion. But ever after that, you couldn't be a GM and say, "Oh, the draft is nothing," and because up until then, it was kind of a throwaway. But that first year that we do in the book, 1971, that's establishes the draft as the way to build a franchise. Unless, of course, you're a team in Southern Ontario.
Yeah, draft snap, exactly. Hey, Evan, you talked about, and both of you talked about how these high first round picks, like the Lafleur thing, the Crosby, the Lemieux, those are all number ones. But there's been teams, and I'm glad you guys wrote about this too. And I look at one team in particular in my lifetime, is that Red Wings draft of 1989, where they basically secure the dynasty that goes 26 years or whatever it was of playoffs every single year. It was a little bit of a Russian invasion, and it wasn't necessarily the guys they drafted in the first round. It was the guys they drafted in the 8th and the 9th and the 10th round. Teams that have had 200 players ahead of them had the opportunity but passed. Tell me about that one. And is that one of the more significant drafts as far as a team going out there and just hauling in superstar after superstar? Because I don't know if there's a comparison.
Right. I think it is one of the most significant ones in terms of how it changed the game. For some people saw how it benefited Detroit so well. Then all of a sudden it became like, oh, what the heck, what were we doing? Why weren't we? There were other teams trying to pick up some Soviet Russian players, but they thought it was, a waste of draft picks, because a lot of those guys were considered to be long shots that would never come. Even in 1989, people thought that the hockey federation there in the Soviet Union would just hold on to these guys.
Right.
And never let them leave. And it was
wasting
kind
a
of
pick, right?
To still get those guys.
Yeah,
like Pavel Bure and Vladimir Konstantinov, and I mean Bure didn't go to the Red Wings, and he could have still. They're on his, he was on their radar too, but instead they just settled to have Fedorov and Konstantinov, and even going outside that, they were just sort of a European kick they were on, because they found Lidstrom in the 3rd round. And the interesting story behind it is that they decided they wanted to take him and not tell anybody else that he was on their radar, because they were worried if the word leaked out that maybe somebody would jump ahead of them and select this sort of project lanky guy that was, not really fully chiseled. And they took him in the 3rd round, and it turned out to be one of the greatest defensemen ever. So it was just a really good, in exploration of how teams, when they're thinking outside the box, can really, set up their franchise for future success. And I think the Red Wings in '89 is the best example in the book of that, of not having a high draft pick and an obvious choice to make, because their first 2 selections that year, I think, were Mike Sillinger and Bob Bugner, who both had decent careers, but they were never superstars, obviously.
They weren't.
No, they weren't. Yeah. It's interesting too when you look at that, because the way that things have changed. Can we agree then that probably trying to hide or not have a player in Europe or almost anywhere on this planet now is almost impossible to disguise a talent that everyone wouldn't know about? I think most people, and centralized scouting and the way it works, I just don't know if we'll ever see unknown players anymore. Is that pretty much true?
There's a great story, Mike, that starts the book. Our friend Eric Duhachik, who of course you knew here in Calgary, tells the story of going to see Gary Suter playing playing college hockey, and Suter walked by him in the hallway. Walked by the scout Ian McKenzie, And Mackenzie said, "Who's that guy?" And I said, "Oh, that's Gary Suter." And he went back to the Central Scouting book, and the book said he was 5'9", and the guy who walked by him was about 6 feet tall. So between the time Central Scouting had done its thing on Suter, and when Mackenzie sees him, he grows. He's over 6 feet. He's about 200 pounds, and he dominates the game. And then, as Evan was just saying about the Red Wings trying to hide, the Flames tried to hide him so no one else would draft him.
Yeah, and that was in '84.
Outside of that Gretzky incident he had, but we won't get into that. Quickly, Bruce, you teased it at the beginning of the interview. A lot of people know the story, that there's some that don't. Why wasn't Wayne Gretzky, arguably the greatest player ever, not drafted?
And one of the things I didn't know going into this book, I knew that was the fact, but I didn't know that the draft year that he would have gone in was probably the greatest draft year ever if you look at the number of Hall of Famers, etc. But the short story is that Gretzky was, of course, in the WHA. He'd been sold to the Edmonton Oilers. The Oilers owner, Peter Pocklington, had the brilliant idea to put him on a personal services contract. And the NHL was going to be accepting 4 teams from the WHA, and Pocklington wanted Edmonton to be one of them. And he went to the league and he said, "I own Wayne Gretzky. If you want Wayne Gretzky, you've got to make Edmonton one of your teams that gets in for the expansion, for the merger." And so he negotiated with them, and the league finally, they didn't want it to happen. But finally, they had to give in. And the other thing, Dave, that's really interesting is up until then, of course, the draft was 20 years old. So they not only did they have to change things around to incorporate Gretzky, get him into the league, but then all of a sudden we have 2 years worth of guys who, between 18 and 20 years old, who weren't drafted previously. They all came into the draft as well. So there's a whole ton of guys. But it was one of the great steals of all time. And of course, Pocklington gets the best player there ever was, at least offensive player. I think Bobby Orr's still the best player, but anyway, the best offensive player ever. And he never has to put him up for draft. It was one of the great maneuvers on draft day.
Yeah, it is. I said it's just incredible to sort of look at the times, how it's changed. I mean, growing up, what the NHL draft, I don't think it was a thing for me. I don't think it was something that I even thought of, simply because, basically because of media. Like I knew even a kid, I knew what the NFL and NBA draft was, especially the NFL draft. The NBA, again, still was, a little bit of a so-so league until Bird and Magic changed that. But it's interesting, like even a guy like Grapes, like Don Cherry used to say, unless you know your kid's going for sure, like don't drive all the way down from Sudbury and sit there all day and not get picked. He couldn't handle the families, and because he'd go up and say, don't come down. We handle the draft differently, and as I said, it's now supposed to be a television spectacle, and they all do things a certain way. I just wonder what it would have, I mean, again, the advent of sports television, and now that we, of course, everyone has it on their phone. I just think it still is an inexact science.
Well, Mike, 1971, and Evan can tell this story, of course. 1971, the Canadians also scored a fantastic player in the draft as well, Larry Robinson. And tell him a little bit about I don't think Robinson even showed up on time for the draft, did he?
No, that's from looking at sources over the years, like a book that he did in the 80s, still when he was playing, I think. And he said that he just got there, barely on time, because he was from, I think it was Metcalfe, Ontario. He's from an even small. I think that's the township. But he's from a really small place there, as on a dairy farm. So he'd barely been outside the rural setting in his life. It's close to Ottawa, so maybe he went there a few times. I'm not sure, but he said he'd only been to Montreal maybe once or twice before that. So his family wasn't familiar with how to navigate the traffic getting in there, so they didn't quite get there. He showed up, I don't know, I think maybe more on time than Lafleur did. Like there was a sort of rush to get to the hotel there, and Guy just walked in as his name was being called barely. Like he had just gotten to the hotel. But in Larry's case, he was selected a couple of rounds later, or much later, I think the 20th pick overall. So he was, he didn't even expect to go that high as well, because this was one of those, this is an era where the Canadians could take a risk on a draft pick like that, because they already had taken Lafleur. So they're looking at other areas of need and thinking, oh, well, we'll take a chance on this guy, because he played just 1 year in what was then the OHA with Kitchener. And before that, it was at the junior A and junior B level. So there was not much exposure to this guy. He just had come up to the major junior level, 19 years old, and the Canadians take him. and he's thinking that there's no way I'm going to be on the Habs anytime soon. Look at all the superstars. Look at all the defensemen that are there, LaPerriere and Guy Lapointe, Serge Savard. But through a combination of injuries and defections to the WHA, he was up with the team 2 years later, and they're winning the Stanley Cup in '73. And then the rest is history because he became one of their all-time great defensemen, one of the great leaders.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a great
For all
story.
that.
Hey,
Mhm.
hey, I remember from being from Stouffville, Keith Acton, when he was drafted by the Canadians, and so he pulls up in his white the Corvette to the high school, which he shouldn't have been doing. But anyway, so he pulls up. The local guy comes in there, and I said, "That's awesome, man." The Canadians goes, "Yeah, great. Have you seen their lineup?" He goes, I'll be in Nova Scotia for the next 10 years, right? I mean, that's basically what he thought of. Look, I know we got to run. We're out of time here, but thrilled that you're both joining us here. The book, Inexact Science, the 6 most compelling draft years in NHL history. And
ECW Press, online now. Order it today. It's an outstanding book. Outstanding. Well done, gentlemen. Well done.
He with the
Thank you very
flower
much.
pot helmet. He's got the flower pot helmet there. Old
yeah,
Yeah.
there it is. There it is. And father, son, you're the house of the book writing industry now, I guess.
Well, we
All
hope
of a
so,
sudden.
yeah.
Yeah, well, I certainly
That's right.
Bruce, expect a call from me later on today. Probably maybe have a nap or something because you had to get up early, and we'll catch up because that will be good.
Okay,
And
man.
Evan, nice to see you doing so well. Just
Yeah.
fabulous what you have done, and great to
Thank
have
you
you
very
this
much.
morning. Best of luck with the book, and we'll talk again very soon.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks,
Bruce
guys.
Dowbiggin, Evan Dowbiggin, Inexact Science, the 6 most compelling draft years in NHL history. A little past the 5s. It's 8:57.